Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. And as the title states, I'd like to talk to you today about the use of activated carbon for mercury control in challenging situations. Okay? So I understand, I guess I have a full half hour to bore you with here today, and I think I have a slightly mixed audience. So I thought for a change I'd start with a little bit of Carbon 101, if you will, because it's something I don't see discussed a lot in presentations. Basically, the high-level view of what is carbon, how does it work, how do we make it, and so forth. But then from there I'll transition into talking about activated carbon for mercury control, but more specifically applying activated carbon in situations that traditionally have been impossible for activated carbon. Situations that include the presence of SO3, for example, situations where you want to preserve the quality of the fly ash for sale to the cement market, and also situations where DSI for SO2 has to be done in conjunction with ACI. That can cause some interference. I'll be illustrating this with, of course, some data with some Calgon carbon products. I'm not here to try and really give you a sales pitch or a commercial. The takeaway I want you to have from this presentation today is that those hurdles that I have listed here traditionally have prevented the use of activated carbon in many situations, but thanks to advancements in the field, those really are being overcome today. Okay. So, believe it or not, activated carbon has over 600 applications, and we service many of those. At Calgon, we're fond of saying that activated carbon is even more useful than duct tape. I think if we could find a way to combine carbon and duct tape, we might really be onto something there. But some of the applications are listed and depicted here. That includes industrial VOCs, agriculture, disinfection byproducts, and so forth. I've got a sort of amusing one here in the bottom right that I've shared before. This is sort of an odor control application, if you will. I keep saying to our sales guys, I think we should hand these out at our booth at conferences. I think it would generate a lot of buzz, but they keep ignoring me. So I guess I'll stick to R&D and let them handle the sales stuff. So what is activated carbon? It's fair to say that it's largely graphitic in nature. What is graphite? Well, let me back up a step further. Sort of a buzzword in science these days you may have been hearing about is something called graphene. This is a single atom thick layer of carbon atoms in which all the carbons are arranged in the hexagonal pattern that you see here. What drives graphene researchers crazy is that those layers don't like to be single layers. Rather, they like to stack up one atop the other in a very, very ordered and very stable fashion. And when they do, that's when you get graphite. And graphite is found in everything from carbon pencil leads to fighter jets. Now, activated carbon is graphitic in nature, but instead of that high degree of order that you have in graphite, it's as if you took those stacked layers and then dropped them. It's like, say, taking a deck of playing cards and dropping it into a hat. Or another analogy is to look at a jar of peanut brittle. You have all these disorganized and jumbled plates fitted together, and it's that disorganization that creates the porosity that makes activated carbon so useful. Okay. In fact, you can find up to 1 million-fold ranges in size as far as the pores go, all the way from visible cracks and granules down to the microscopic. The old timers back at Calgon Carbon like to argue that activated carbon is the original nanotech. I'm not sure that I agree with them on that point, but I get where they're coming from. However, when it comes to adsorption, it's really only the smallest 5-fold range of pore sizes that do the work, that do the adsorption. Okay. There are some pores that do the adsorption, and then there are larger ones that help transport through the particle, or through the granule, if you will, to get to those adsorption pores. Here again, to use some analogies, sometimes we like to compare it to the highway system, where your large interstates and your highways are your transport pores. You come off to smaller side roads, which are your finer transport pores, and eventually wind up at your driveways, which would compare to your adsorption pores. Or another analogy is the hotel, where you walk into the large lobby and then go down smaller halls and eventually wind up with all your hotel rooms, which again are your adsorption pores. Okay. So when it comes to activated carbon, you'll hear terms thrown around like adsorption and absorption. It can be a little confusing. When it comes to activated carbon, what's going on here is adsorption. Okay, that means When something is picked up by activated carbon, it's sticking to the activated carbon, as you see in this diagram here. That's in contrast to the absorption process, whereby a sorbent would actually take something within itself and consequently it would swell. And there are sorbents that do that. For instance, there are some clays that will adsorb in that manner and actually swell. Okay. Here's just another picture to help you visualize what's going on here. If you will, these would be particles or granules of activated carbon, and then your disordered graphitic plates. Okay. So activated carbon can be made from quite a wide variety of starting materials. All you need is something very, very carbonaceous to start with. That could be coal, it could be tires, it could even be chicken poop. All right. However, the material that you start with is going to dictate the final properties in your final product. The ash impurities are inherited. Density and hardness of your product are closely linked to the starting material. Of course, your overall porosities depend on starting materials a lot. And really, each starting material gives you a unique class of products. So that in the end, what you make from bituminous coal is not the same as what you make from lignite coal or coconuts or wood or what have you. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. How do we make activated carbon? In a nutshell, there are 3 different ways to do it. At Calgon Carbon, because we use bituminous coals, we rely on a process we call reagglomeration. And that involves a thermal activation at the end step. You can skip the agglomeration step and do what's called direct activation. That's also a thermally based activation. And then thirdly, there's also chemical activation. It's something I won't really delve into today. Here's a depiction of those 2 different processes, though, reagglomerated and direct activation. On the top, we have the reagglomerated depicted. What we'll typically do is we'll take usually a blend of coals, bituminous coals, and we'll crush them up in the pulverizer. And then we'll actually take that crushed coal and we'll glue it back together. We do that with a petroleum-based pitch product. And then we go and we smash it again, which seems utterly counterintuitive, right? But there's actually a good reason for that. What happens to that pitch in the next step, in the baking, is that it breaks down and volatilizes away. And in doing so, you've artificially now created transport pore structure in your activated carbon. Okay? By contrast, with direct activation, they skip this reagglomeration step. And in certain cases, depending on your starting materials, you can even skip the baking step and go straight to the activator. And then in the end, you come out with this nice black product. We have this horrible joke in the activated carbon industry that we can make carbon in any color you like, as long as it's black. Right? But what you have is a granular product, all the VM driven out, very, very high surface area and porosity, and very, very inert material. I understand it was stated yesterday that there's a risk of explosivity with activated carbon. Can activated carbon be explosive? Yes, it can. However, even my shoes could be made to be explosive, right? Anything that can potentially combust at all, given the right conditions and enough energy input, can be made to explode. But practically speaking, is activated carbon an explosion concern? No, it is not. We've been submitting samples of activated carbon to experts in the explosivity testing industry for decades now. The KST values that come back, that's the best value for comparing the inherent explosivity of one powder to another. That KST value consistently comes back at under 100, which puts it in the weak explosion category, which puts it on par with something like powdered milk. Personally, I wouldn't be afraid to have a silo of powdered milk on my site. And furthermore, recall that powdered carbon has been used to treat flue gas for decades now, since the 1990s at least, in both North America and Europe. And to my knowledge, there's never been an explosion of virgin powder-activated carbon. And if you think about it, activated carbon is much like charcoal. Has anybody here cooked with charcoal before? Do you put a match to it to light it? It takes a little more than that. You have to put on the lighter fluid. In effect, you're adding the VM back that you drove out in the first place so you can get the stuff to burn. And furthermore, when it does burn, it doesn't go up in a big fireball. It's a slow smolder type of burn. So not very explosive, also even very hard to ignite. I'm sorry, that's all I have to say about that. Moving on. So why do we do that reagglomeration step? Why the extra work? It is extra work. It does add cost, but there are real advantages to it for us. On the left, this is a depiction of what you would obtain without that step, without those extra transport pores that we were creating. What you get is a nice activation of the outer part of a particle, but often inside, the volatile matter you want to drive out can't get out, and then later the steam you want to drive in for the activation chemistry can't get there. And so you wind up with kind of wasted material here. Well, in contrast, by creating that pore structure with the reagglomeration step, now we have a very evenly activated carbon particle. Okay. So when it comes to adsorption with activated carbon, what affects the rates? Kinetics are a big deal, pore diffusion, transport pore structures, we talked about that already, and the effect of those different pore structures on the rates. Okay. When it comes to the adsorption pores, again, it's the finest, the 5-fold smallest pores that do all the work. They do the work because there are van der Waals interactions that hold them inside those pores. And on a volume basis, these represent about 40% of a particle of a high activity bituminous carbon. Okay. When you consider the transport pores, again, these are larger. These never do any adsorption work, but again, they're necessary so that the adsorption pores can be reached. And these represent about 25% of the volume of a high-activity bituminous carbon particle. And so now I'd like to go through an exercise where we just gradually zoom down in on some activated carbon. Okay. We start at 10-fold magnification and then jump to 100-fold. Here you can still see some of the visible macroscopic scale cracks. Okay. And if we zoom down even further to, say, 1,000-fold, now you can begin to see some of that artificial pore structure that I was talking about that's created by the pitch. Okay. These gaps that you see here. Zooming down even further, 1,000,000-fold magnification. Now here you would be able to begin to see the graphitic structure, those individual plates that we talked about inside activated carbon. Okay. And then finally, zooming down into 10 million, I think it is. There we go. Now we really get a good look at those plates, right? And we see that some of them stack. We see that some of them are covalently bonded. Some of them are, don't stack very well and leave larger gaps. And so next is a visualization of activated carbon adsorbing something. There we go. There we go. Okay. Gradually, the adsorbate begins to fill up the pores. It's going to fill in the smaller gaps in between the plates. Okay. Notice wherever we have larger gaps, though, it doesn't fill in. That's because that's where those transport pores are. Okay. So I want to transition now to talking about activated carbon for mercury control. Different ways of improving carbons for getting mercury have been known for a long time. Sulfur addition helps in certain situations. Halogen addition has been known for decades. Incinerators were first regulated under the Clean Air Mercury Act in the 1990s. And so, it was in the 1990s that Calgon Carbon first introduced its flue pack line. And in a nutshell, it was found that mercury control for incinerators was relatively easy. Okay. Fast forward to regulating the utility sector for mercury. Fortunately, the EPA recognized that it was going to be a good deal more difficult compared to the incinerator fleet. And indeed, it was found that early commodity-type activated carbons fared very poorly. Therefore, early market projections for activated carbon were sky high. Even as late as 2010, projections were as high as 1.5 billion pounds per year. However, a lot of progress has been made since then. Injection rates in general have been brought way down, especially with PRB-fired units. I could show you plenty of examples of that. But again, what I really want to focus on today is what has traditionally been the hardest hurdles to overcome when it comes to using activated carbon for mercury control. Again, high SO3 environments, preservation of ash, and interference with DSI. Okay. So by now, I think most of us in the audience know that SO3 has a hugely deleterious impact on the performance of activated carbon. Here I'm showing you some old data presented by the good folks at ADA-ES. This involves testing that was done at the Labadie station, where they inject SO3 to condition the flue gas for the ESP. And what you have here is percent mercury removal versus feed rate. And you can see that when they started out without any SO3 injection, they did fairly well. But already with 5 parts per million of SO3, performance severely deteriorates. And by the time you're out to 8 to 10 parts per million SO3, now you're really, really struggling and maxing out at about 45% removal. Okay. Why is SO3 so bad? What are some of the possible mechanisms? There have been some anecdotal reports that high SO3 tends to interfere with mercury oxidation. Perhaps that's an effect of the Griffin reaction you see here. This is a reversible reaction. A lot of people feel that there are some camps who feel that diatomic bromine is the better oxidizer. There are those who feel that HBr is the better oxidizer. I'm not here to tell you which one is which. Does SO3 simply compete with mercury for the same adsorption sites on activated carbon? This is the hypothesis most often put forth. After all, activated carbon is known to readily absorb sulfuric acid. Or does SO3 attack adsorbed mercury 2 compounds already on the carbon? Once again, there have been some anecdotal reports where people have reported that they run carbon traps in streams that contain high SO3 and find that instead of most of the mercury found being in the first plug, rather they find it pushed all the way back to the last one. So does that imply that the SO3 etches away absorbed mercury and keeps pushing it back? Once again, I don't know. I'm not here to tell you which one of these is the most important. In fact, there's a good chance it's a combination of factors. Okay. So moving on from rank speculation. Here we have a case study that I like very much. I think this really illustrates the impacts of SO3 very well. This was carried out at a PRB-fired site with an ESP that uses SO3 injection for flue gas conditioning, and they were able to very precisely meter in that SO3. We started out with a non-brominated carbon combined with calcium bromide, and right off the bat, that did very well, greater than 90% at less than 2 pounds per million. But right off the bat, by adding just 3 parts per million SO3, now we're pushed out to here about 5 pounds for the same performance. And by the time you get to 6 parts per million of SO3, now we need 10 pounds per million ACF for that same performance. Okay? But we came armed here with a different product, one that's designed to be SO3 tolerant, FluePack ST. ST stands for sulfur tolerant. That's the data you see now in the circles. In yellow, that's ST at 3 parts per million SO3, doing quite well at 2 pounds. Notice a much, much less dramatic shift in performance when we increase to 6 parts per million SO3. Okay. This is some of that same data, but replotted in terms of stack emissions versus the carbon feed rate. Here the target was to hit 008 pounds per gigawatt hour. At 3 parts per million SO3, the ST product, the sulfur-tolerant product, gets you in compliance at around 1.5 to 2 pounds per million ACF. By contrast, the non-brominated carbon requires at least 5 pounds per million ACF. And now at even higher levels of SO3, 6 and 9, still ST, sulfur-tolerant product, compliant somewhere between 3 and 4 pounds per million. Again, with the non-brominated product, we need at least 8 pounds per million. Okay? And some other data points I'll quickly point out. Here's ST at 7.5 parts per million SO3. Here's ST all the way up at 9 parts per million SO3. Still heading compliance at a very reasonable feed rate, 5.5 pounds per million ACF. Okay. One other case study I wanted to share with you. This was carried out at a Texas lignite-fired site with an ESP. They also employ SO3 flue gas conditioning, but thanks to the sulfur in the coal, they also have native SO3 to deal with. Okay. Usual coal on a good day contained about 15 to 20 pounds of mercury per trillion BTU, already pretty high. And when you look at the emissions without any carbon injection, you wondered what did they have to worry about, right? And indeed, with just a little bit of pack, you're already well under the compliance limit. However, they soon ran into They ran into some bad coal. What do I mean by bad coal? Well, the mercury content just about doubled. Now we're at about 30 to 35 pounds per trillion BTU at the inlet. and SO3 went up to 17 to 18 parts per million. Despite that, a sulfur-tolerant product was still able to get to compliance, once again, at a very, very reasonable feed rate, just over 2.5 pounds per million ACF. So I would return to this slide to put that into perspective. Here, with a standard pack, if you were at that much SO3, 18 parts per million, where would you be? You'd be out of luck, right? But thanks to the development in sulfur tolerance, these situations are now very doable. Okay, and one last SO3 example. If you'll permit me to brag a little bit, I will here. Back in September of last year, Southern Company decided to team with EPRI and conduct an ACI test at the Mercury Research Center that was focused around injecting in streams with SO3. So they solicited all the best products from all the vendors. In total, there were 20 products submitted by 8 different vendors. Here's just a sampling of the data, but you can see that the 3 Calgon products that were submitted took spots 1, 2, and 3. It's like having your team go to the Olympics and take gold, silver, and bronze. I really, really enjoy this kind of data because I can't make it up. This was generated by somebody else. So when I tell you I've got the best, I'm not full of it. Okay. So I'll quit bragging. So I want to move on to the next topic of fly ash compatibility. This is usually determined by a test called the foam index. Okay. Here we have an example where some foam index testing was done by an independent fly ash broker. We find that fly ash brokers are gradually catching on to the fact that bituminous-based carbons tend to be more concrete-friendly inherently. Baseline fly ash here has this baseline foam index number. The addition of bituminous-based packs, of course, increases the foam index number, but in comparison to the lignite samples that you see here, even one deemed to be concrete-friendly, it requires far less air entrainment additive. Okay. Why is that? One of the big differences between bituminous coal and lignite coal is lignite has far more volatile matter in it. So when you go through the thermal steps and you blast it all out of there, you naturally create far more of a mesoporosity. So these are some of the larger pores. And those larger pores are good at absorbing larger molecules, which includes air entrainment additives, which are surfactants, basically. They're these long, greasy molecules you'll see here. Okay. So these are some of the, this is a very crude diagram, but some of the larger pores you can see in a microscope. This is 2,000-fold magnification. The adsorption pores, the smaller ones that we talked about, very hard to see here even at 400,000-fold magnification, but those pores tend to be less than a nanometer in diameter. Okay. So in the end, what you want is a balance of that micro porosity and macro porosity, so that you can maximize access to your micropores to absorb the mercury like you want to, but minimize absorption of the air entrainment additives. Okay. And here's some full-scale results as far as foam index testing goes. This comes from a full-scale trial where we collected samples out of the ESP every day. We got an idea of how much carbon was in the ash by measuring the LOI, and you can see foam index plotted versus the percent carbon in ash. The Calgon bituminous-based samples fall on this nice line, whereas we have one sample here that was a mix of bituminous and lignite coals. You can see it already starts to fall off the line. And up here, you can see that the lignite-based pack absorbs far more air entrainment additive. Come on. Okay. And furthermore, you'll see that down here, there's less carbon in ash versus the lignite pack samples. That's because those products required less product. They were higher performance products. And so, as we like to put it, we have really a two-pronged approach when it comes to fly ash preservation. Number one, that is, you use a bituminous-based pack that's inherently concrete-friendly. But number two, you use a product that really kicks butt and that requires far less or far lower feed rates in the first place. Okay. And finally, on the final topic, DSI interference with ACI. Again, what are some of the possible causes here? It's known that the use of DSI, specifically for SO2 control, where very high flow rates are required, that it can really have a deleterious impact on mercury capture with ACI. In those cases, It's always recommended to separate the injection points of the two products as much as possible. Sadly, that's not always possible. Okay. That high level of absorbent that's needed for SO2 control has the unwanted effect sometimes of also knocking down the halogens in the flue gas, and of course those halogens are important for the oxidation of mercury. Right? And then another possibility, it's known that with sodium-based sorbents like trona and sodium bicarbonate, that sometimes you get this byproduct evolution of a few parts per million of NO2. And some people think that NO2 competes with mercury for sites on the carbon. And this is a possibility. It is known that PAC will adsorb NO2, not particularly well, but it will. And personally, I'm still on the fence. Could be one or either, or it could be both of these. Okay? But I can think of some neat tests I'd like to try to figure that out. Here's a full-scale example. This was conducted jointly with, I think EPRI sponsored this test. This was carried out at the Stanton station. This is a 140 megawatt PRB-fired unit with an ESP. Actually, they have two ESPs, as you see in the flow diagram. So, and not only do they have two ESPs, but they have three air preheaters. There's a central primary air preheater and then two secondaries. And a lot of different injection scenarios were tested in which both products were injected in front of the secondaries and so forth. In the end, what was found to work best was to put the DSI in front of the primary air preheater and then the carbon in front of the secondary air preheaters. And that gave each product a little bit of time to do its thing before they eventually met and saw each other in the duct. And that helped a lot. Nevertheless, it was still found that the trona that was used did have a deleterious impact on brominated carbons. Okay? Kind of a busy slide here, but we have outlet mercury emissions plotted versus carbon feed rates. All of these points were generated while trona was being injected somewhere between 500 and 6,000 pounds an hour. Okay? The data set that I'd like to draw your attention to, of course, is the one pointed out with the arrows. This is where we came with FluePack ST. And you can see that there's almost no impact of the trona feed rates between 500 and 6,000 pounds an hour on the performance of the mercury capture there, okay? In contrast to some of the others here. And so finally, I just wanted to close with this. These are some rough estimate curves that were put forth by URS years ago. I think a lot of us have seen these by now. But as we continue to improve on the performance of these products and overcome these hurdles, effectively what we're doing is we're pushing all of these far to the left, right? Whether it's Western coal in a baghouse or Western coal in an ESP, or even low sulfur Eastern bituminous coal with an ESP. Notice I don't show a shift for this category for high sulfur Eastern bituminous. It's going to get more complicated there. I think in all those situations you're going to have a wet scrubber on the back end, and it's difficult to decipher exactly what's doing what. It's because of these improvements, though, that we feel that the market demand for activated carbon on an annual basis will be far, far lower than earlier predicted. I don't want to put firm numbers on it. That gives our investor relations people severe heartburn. But at the same time, consider that if we make this group treatable, and we are, now we're able to treat situations with activated carbon that before we couldn't have. So that will add a little bit to the overall picture. So I'll just leave you with that to chew on. And so to summarize, I hope I made my point that advances in SO3 tolerant products have led to much lower feed rates for streams that have SO3. And furthermore, ACI is now possible in many situations with SO3 where before it wasn't possible at all. Okay. As far as fly ash compatibility, through a two-pronged approach of using inherently concrete-friendly bituminous-based products and using high-performance products to keep the rates low, usually we think that fly ash can be saved for cement sales. And furthermore, there are advanced carbon products on the market that will work very well in conjunction with DSI where that's necessary. Okay. And my final point is that we don't sit still. ASCI, activated carbon, continues to improve. Therefore, before purchasing activated carbon, before even purchasing a system, we always highly recommend that you do an activated carbon test so you can have a much more informed opinion. And furthermore, you yourself shouldn't sit still. Keep in mind that carbons are improving, and maybe you can go to your vendor and ask for their latest product and see a benefit there. Okay. So with that, I'll wrap it up.
Great. We'll take any questions from the floor.
Any questions?
All right.
Anyone?
Great.
All right. Thank you.
And our last presenter this afternoon, our morning has gotten